Hey friends, tonight we begin our journey into the surprisingly trippy world of ancient Egyptian recreational chemistry. Yes, the same civilization that gave us the pyramids, sacred mummies, and some of the oldest written texts on Earth, also had festivals wild enough to rival your college roommate's most questionable nights. Before we sink into the past, take a moment to gently like this video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy these deep dives into strange, forgotten corners of history. And I'd love to hear in the comments, which ancient culture fascinates you most? Now, dim the lights, settle into something cozy, and let's step quietly into the perfumed, candlelit shadows of Egypt, where getting high wasn't just fun, it was divine. Welcome to ancient Egypt, where the line between medicine, magic, ritual, and, well, recreational chemistry was so blurred it might as well have been written in smoke. Buckle up, or better yet, lie down and relax, because tonight we're drifting into the hazy, sacred, surprisingly trippy world of the ancient Egyptians. And believe me, it's not what your history teacher told you. The myth behind the munchies. Our first tale begins with a goddess. Her name? Sekhmet. Lioness-headed, fierce-eyed. The kind of deity you wouldn't want to cut in line at the afterlife. According to one of Egypt's most dramatic myths, Sekhmet once went on a rampage. Humans had offended the gods, classic, and so Sekhmet was sent down to Earth to dish out divine punishment. And punish she did. We're talking mass destruction, fields soaked in blood, mortals running for cover. You get the picture. But here's where it gets wild. Ra, the sun god, sees that Sekhmet's little anger episode has gone way too far. So what does he do? He gets her drunk. Not just tipsy. Not just merry. Obliterated. He dyes thousands of jugs of beer red to look like blood and pours it all over the ground. Sekhmet sees the Red River, assumes it's blood, laps it up like it's happy hour in the desert, and passes out. The world is saved by what is essentially the oldest recorded use of alcohol to prevent a global catastrophe. Just pause for a second. This is how the ancient Egyptians explained why humanity wasn't wiped out. The goddess got plastered. And this wasn't just a bedtime story. They actually reenacted this tale during festivals. Every year, thousands would gather to honor Sekhmet with music, dance, chanting, and lots of lotus wine. Which leads us to our next mind-blowing discovery. The blue lotus. More than just a pretty petal. You've probably seen it carved on temple walls or floating in tomb paintings. The beautiful, delicate blue lotus. But this flower wasn't just decoration. It was the real OG of ancient Egyptian party supplies. Scientifically known as Nymphea caerulea, the blue lotus contains alkaloids that act like a mild sedative and euphoriant. Think of it as the ancient version of a calming herbal vape, only dipped in divinity. Egyptians would steep the flowers in wine, creating a mildly psychoactive beverage that relaxed the body and lifted the mind. Not enough to make you see pyramids float, but enough to feel a soft euphoria, a dreamy weightlessness, a divine clarity. Archaeologists have even found remnants of lotus petals in burial chambers, tucked into the wraps of mummies, laid beside golden goblets. Pharaohs and priests didn't just want wealth or protection in the afterlife. They wanted bliss. And here's a spicy detail. The blue lotus also had aphrodisiac qualities. Yep. The same flower that symbolized rebirth and spirituality was also part of ancient love potions. Imagine attending a sacred ritual where gods were invoked. Incense filled the air, and everyone was sipping on this floral, happy juice. Modern tests show it can increase dopamine, the feel-good neurotransmitter, and promote relaxation. It wasn't just spiritual. It was deeply sensual, trippy, serene, and possibly the reason why some ancient murals feature people with smiles far too wide for someone just enjoying a banquet. Incense, smoke, and snakes in the sky. But let's not forget about another popular path to altered consciousness in the land of the Nile: smoke. Temples were filled with the curling scent of kifi, a sacred incense blend made with honey, raisins, wine, frankincense, myrrh, and other exotic resins. It wasn't just for masking smells or warding off mosquitoes. Kifi was thought to open the mind to divine communication, soften the veil between the mortal and spiritual world, and when burned in closed chambers, that fragrant smoke had the power to, let's say, loosen the mind. Combined with rhythmic chanting, drumming, and hypnotic rituals, this wasn't just temple decor. It was a trip, a cosmic elevator ride straight to the sky gods. One ancient text even describes priests speaking in many tongues after breathing in kifi, possibly our earliest reference to an incense-fueled trance state. Were they hallucinating? Meditating? Both. Modern scholars can't say for sure, but some kifi ingredients, like henbane and juniper, have mild psychoactive effects. And when you burn them in a small room while chanting prayers for 3 hours straight, let's just say your brain's probably seeing cobras dance across the stars, tripping with the dead, rituals of passage. Now, hold tight, because it's about to get a little, well, spiritual. In ancient Egypt, the boundary between the living and the dead wasn't a brick wall. It was more like a silk curtain, and often that curtain was lifted with the help of psychoactive substances. Priests would prepare the body of the deceased with sacred oils infused with mandrake, opium poppies, and blue lotus. These weren't just preservatives, they were mind bridges. During funerary rites, participants would inhale incense, drink sacred wine, and recite spells from the Book of the Dead, designed to guide the soul through the underworld. These weren't calm, sleepy ceremonies, they were cosmic. Imagine being in a pitch-dark chamber, walls flickering with torchlight, the air thick with the smell of exotic herbs. You've just consumed a wine infused with a flower that makes your thoughts slow and floaty. The priest's voice echoes around you, chanting prayers meant to open the gates of the beyond. And suddenly, maybe you see your ancestor, maybe a god, or maybe you just feel light and safe, like drifting down the Nile under moonlight. Was it real? To the Egyptians, there was no such thing as just imagination. Visions were messages, dreams were visits, and altered states, those were pathways to truth. Closing this chapter and peeking at the next. So far, we've seen beer save the world, goddesses get tipsy, lotuses spark love spells, and incense bring the dead to whisper in the ears of the living. But we're only scratching the surface, because next, we dive into the real recipes, the forbidden herbs, the narcotic ointments worn by royalty, and how even the mighty Cleopatra may have used scent and smoke to seduce the minds of empires. Segment 2. The temple wasn't just for worship, it was for tripping too. Let's imagine you're stepping barefoot onto the cool, polished stone of an ancient Egyptian temple floor. The columns rise like stone trees, painted with sacred lotus blossoms and scenes of gods sailing across starry skies. The air smells faintly of incense and crushed herbs. The flickering of oil lamps makes the shadows dance, and a deep, rhythmic chanting fills the chamber. It's not just beautiful, it's hypnotic. But what if I told you? This temple wasn't just a place of prayer. It was also a full-on sensory chamber, designed to blow your ancient mind. Let's rewind. The ancient Egyptians didn't divide life like we do, into religion over here, medicine over there, and a Friday night hangout in another corner. For them, everything spiritual, medical, and cosmic blended together like a Nile flood washing over the fields. And when it came to altered states of consciousness, the temples were ground zero. You weren't just coming here to light a candle and leave. You were here to experience something otherworldly, something divine, something psychedelic. Priest or shaman? Why the pharaoh's healers dabbled in visions. We often imagine Egyptian priests as these stiff, solemn figures in spotless linen, muttering prayers under their breath. But in many ways, they were more like shamans. They didn't just offer blessings. They entered altered states of consciousness to commune with the divine. There are temple inscriptions and ritual texts, like the ritual of the opening of the mouth, that include chants, rhythm, sound, scent, and touch, all carefully choreographed. These weren't just ceremonial. They were meant to shift your state of awareness. And sometimes, these rituals included certain enhancements. Among the papyri we found, especially the Ebers Papyrus, which is one of the oldest medical texts in history, dating back to around 1550 BCE, there are hints at psychoactive ingredients. It describes remedies for ailments of the mind and soul, what we'd now call anxiety, hallucinations, or sleep disorders. And what's in those remedies? Lotus, henbane, mandrake, possibly cannabis. These weren't just garden herbs for flavor. They were the ancient version of mind-benders, the sacred blue lotus. Not just a pretty flower. The blue lotus. It's everywhere in ancient Egyptian art. People are holding it, sniffing it, swimming through ponds filled with it. At first glance, it seems like a floral motif. But then you realize, no one paints roses on the walls for 3,000 years unless there's something more going on. The blue lotus, Nymphea caerulea, was soaked in wine or steeped in water to produce a mild psychoactive effect. It didn't make you see full-blown hallucinations like some plants, but it could induce euphoria, a dreamlike state, and even sexual arousal. Yes, ancient Egyptians were literally sipping lotus-laced wine at banquets, temples, and tomb rituals. Imagine a mix of wine, incense, chants, and the warm air filled with sacred symbolism. You're not just partying, you're ascending. Some scholars argue that temple rituals involving the blue lotus were used to help priests see the gods, interpret dreams, or receive divine messages. Think of it like tuning into a holy radio station, except your antenna is floral and fermented, sent as psychedelia, frankincense, myrrh, and the high priests. Have you ever walked into a room and the smell instantly transported you back to a memory? Maybe a whiff of your grandmother's kitchen or the perfume of an old friend. The ancient Egyptians understood this on a spiritual level. But they took it further. Way further. Temples were filled with frankincense, myrrh, and kifi, a resinous, musky incense made of over a dozen ingredients including raisins, wine, honey, juniper, and cinnamon. Kifi wasn't just perfume. It was medicine. And it may have been psychoactive. Some modern researchers think that burning kifi in enclosed spaces could have created a mildly euphoric, sedative atmosphere. Combine that with the rhythm of chanting and the flicker of lamps, and you're basically stepping into a dream, one tailored by the priests themselves. In fact, inscriptions on temple walls speak of kifi as a tool for banishing nightmares, greeting the gods, and opening the gates of the sky. This wasn't Febreze. This was cosmic aromatherapy. Soundscapes of the gods. Trance through music. The Egyptians also understood something that modern rave DJs and meditation experts both agree on. Sound can shift consciousness. Inside certain temples, especially the Temple of Hathor at Dendra, priests used instruments like sistra, rattles, harps, flutes, and drums to create a rhythm that aligned with the human heartbeat. These weren't random jams. They were precisely timed and tuned. The sistrum, a sacred rattle, wasn't just shaken for fun. Its repetitive, shimmering sound was said to awaken deities and induce a trance-like state in worshippers. Hathor, the goddess of joy, music, and love, was often worshipped with these sonic rituals. Imagine this. You're in a dark temple chamber, the air thick with kifi smoke, your senses dulled from blue lotus wine. A priestess in flowing linen begins to shake a sistrum rhythmically, faster and faster. The sound vibrates in your skull, your breath slows, your limbs feel light. And then, a vision, or a feeling, or the sense that something beyond you has entered the room. Was it the gods, your own mind, or both? Are we looking at a spiritual psychedelic culture? Some Egyptologists are cautious about calling this drug use. There's always a risk of projecting modern ideas onto ancient practices. But the pieces are too consistent to ignore. Mind-altering herbs, euphoria-inducing incense, trance music, hypnotic architecture, a culture obsessed with dreams, death, rebirth, and the afterlife. It starts to sound less like ancient ritual and more like a spiritual psychedelic practice. And it wasn't recreational. It was intentional. These tools were used to connect with the gods, heal the sick, guide the dying, and glimpse the afterlife. It was sacred, structured, and deeply meaningful. So the next time you see a scene of ancient priests waving incense and offering flowers, don't think of it as stiff ceremony. Think of it as a curated experience, a sensory journey designed to shift consciousness, like a temple rave, but with more gold and fewer glow sticks. Would you walk into that temple, take a sip of lotus wine, and let the scent of Kiffy guide you into the realm of gods? Or would you run for the hills, clutching your amulet, swearing never to inhale temple smoke again? Let me know in the comments. Segment 3. The temple wasn't just for prayer. It was for psychedelic journeys. Let's slow down for a moment. The heat of the Egyptian sun was still pulsing against the golden stones, and the scent of incense curled lazily through the temple halls. In the hush of these ancient sanctuaries, the air thick with mystery, something much more than prayer was unfolding. Imagine stepping barefoot onto the cool floor of a temple like Karnak or Edfu. Pillars tower above you, carved with gods mid-flight and eyes that never blink. But this wasn't just architecture. It was a mood designed to transport you, body, mind, and soul, far beyond this dusty world. Because here's the secret. Egyptian temples were built like machines for transformation. And sometimes, that transformation involved getting just a little altered. Let's talk about ritual highs, not the kind you'd find at a modern music festival, but ancient, carefully orchestrated, deeply spiritual experiences designed to open your senses, unlock visions, and dissolve the boundary between mortal and divine. You see, in Egypt, a temple wasn't just a religious center. It was more like a cosmic bridge. The goal wasn't to worship from afar. The goal was to meet the gods directly. And the priests, especially the high-ranking ones, had tools to help them do just that. So, what kind of tools, you ask? Let's start with Blue Lotus, the plant that dominated Egyptian art like a celebrity with a really good PR team. This delicate water lily, with its curling petals, wasn't just pretty. It had mild psychoactive effects. When steeped in wine or burned as incense, it could produce a soft, dreamlike euphoria. Imagine sitting in a dark chamber, soft chants echoing through the stone, the scent of blue lotus wrapping around you like silk. It wasn't about getting blasted. It was about entering a different state of sacred awareness. And they didn't stop there. Some scholars believe Egyptian priests may have used mandrake, henbane, and other nightshade family plants in small, precise doses. These plants, in the right amounts, could produce vivid visions, even sensations of floating or disembodiment. Not recreational. These were ritual tools, guarded closely, administered in exact ways, often combined with fasting, chanting, and rhythmic movement. Imagine a ceremony in the inner sanctum of the Temple of Hathor at Dendra. The priest is anointed with oils. Incense spirals in the lamplight. He drinks a wine infused with lotus and mandrake. Soft music hums, just a harp or a flute, and then the veil lifts. The statues aren't statues anymore. The gods breathe, shimmer, move. What would you do if the stone lion-headed Sekhmet turned her gaze to you? Some would argue this is pure metaphor, but others, historians, archaeologists, ethnobotanists, think the Egyptians were deliberately seeking altered states, and their temples were designed to amplify those experiences. Think about it. The high ceilings, the echoing acoustics, the sudden plunge from bright sun into shadowy halls. It's sensory theatre, a show where you are the audience, and also the main act. Now, picture the walls, covered with hieroglyphs. Not just decorative, they were living spells. Some incantations were meant to be spoken aloud. Others were sound spells embedded in the architecture. Say the right words in the right tone and frequency, and the walls answer back. Or so they believed. And remember, most Egyptians couldn't read, but the priests could. They had the keys, and they used them. Even the temple floor plan tells a story. From the open courtyards, accessible to the public, you'd move through a series of progressively smaller, darker, holier rooms until you reached the naos, the Holy of Holies, where the statue of the god lived. Each step deeper into the temple was like diving deeper into the subconscious. It wasn't about believing, it was about experiencing. Now, let's pause for a moment. Can you imagine what it felt like to lie on a stone healing bed in the temple of Imhotep, god of medicine? You've been fasting. The priest has given you a sweet herbal infusion, maybe with opium, maybe lotus. You close your eyes. Chanting surrounds you like a heartbeat. You drift, float, and dream. And in your dream, the god visits you. He shows you what ails you, and how to cure it. You wake, sweating, confused, transformed. This was called incubation, and temples were built for it. The Greeks later borrowed this exact practice in the temples of Asclepius. But Egypt did it first, and maybe more magically. Let's not forget the acoustics, either. In places like the Serapeum of Saqqara or the hyperstyle Hall of Karnak, even a whisper could bounce in haunting ways. Some scholars believe that deep-voiced priests, trained to chant at specific frequencies, created soundscapes that altered brainwaves, essentially turning the temple into a giant, humming meditation chamber. Modern experiments show that certain low-frequency vibrations can induce trance-like states, similar to those produced by rhythmic drumming or Tibetan singing bowls. Did the Egyptians figure this out long before we did? It's possible. Some claim that the Osirian at Abydos may have used infrasound, frequencies below the threshold of hearing, to trigger mystical experiences. That's still controversial, but it's a thrilling thought, isn't it? So here's the bigger idea. Egyptian religion wasn't just about pleasing the gods. It was about entering their world. They used architecture, plants, sound, and ritual to create a full-body, full-soul experience. And for the priests, this was serious work. Initiation took decades. You didn't just learn theology. You learned how to shape your mind, control your breath, channel energy. A high priest of Thoth wasn't just a scholar. He was a spiritual technologist, a master of altered states. And unlike today, where altered states are often seen as recreational or even taboo, for the Egyptians, they were a pathway to truth, a necessary, sacred part of accessing divine wisdom. So, the next time you walk through an old cathedral, or a quiet hall filled with incense, or hear a piece of music that makes your skin tingle, maybe you're feeling a sliver of what the Egyptians once chased so carefully. Not chaos, not escape, but alignment with something greater. Soft pause. Now take a breath. The incense is fading. The candle flickers lower. But our journey is far from over. Because if the temples were designed to open your mind, what did the tombs do? That's exactly where we're headed next. Backhand index pointing right. Are you still with me? Would you walk into the darkness of an Egyptian tomb, knowing it might change everything you believe about death and life? Comment below. What temple or ancient place would you visit if you could experience its rituals? Segment 4. The Garden of Lotus and Laughter. Egyptian parties, beer rivers, and a touch of magic. Now that we've wandered the smoky halls of temples and learned how Egyptians flirted with the divine while chasing visions from their blue water pipes, let's take a breath, deep and warm, and step into something a little more festive. Imagine a garden in full bloom beside the Nile. Papyrus stalks wave gently in the breeze. The moon is climbing slowly, and candles flicker in alabaster holders. Laughter bubbles like the sweet beer being passed in palm leaf cups. Music drifts through the night. Flutes, drums, and harps, and dancers swirl in sheer linen with gold-threaded anklets jingling like soft bells. This, dear listener, is not a myth. This is an ancient Egyptian party. And you're invited. Beer mug, the party never died. Getting lit in Luxor. Contrary to what dusty museum exhibits might suggest, ancient Egyptians were no solemn, stiff bunch. They were thrill-seekers, social butterflies, and skilled party planners who believed in living well before their trip to the afterlife. How well? Let's just say, Vegas could take a few notes. Their festivals, often tied to religious holidays or seasonal transitions, were no casual potlucks. These were full-blown, Nile-side extravaganzas that could last several days. And central to all of it, beer, wine, and something called Lotus-based elixirs. One ancient scroll proudly recounts a festival in the city of Dendera where beer flowed like the Nile, and men forgot their names in laughter. Some modern archaeologists even joke that the first beer pong match might have occurred somewhere around 1500 BCE, with clay cups and sacred cheer. But don't be fooled. Beer wasn't just a party drink. It was their daily bread, often literally. Everyone from farmers to priests drank it, even children. Except at festivals they might supercharge it with herbs, date syrups, and, yep, blue lotus extract. Cherry blossom, the lotus lounge effect. We've talked about the blue lotus and its dreamy, semi-narcotic properties in earlier segments, but here's the thing. At parties, it was the VIP guest. Ancient Egyptian texts and frescoes show elegant women sipping wine laced with lotus, lounging on cushions while servants fanned them with ostrich feathers. It was said to make one light of heart, full of mirth, and distant from sadness. One 18th dynasty poem even describes the feeling as walking among stars while lying on earth. And the gods approved. The lotus was considered a sacred flower, a symbol of rebirth and pleasure. So, indulging wasn't considered sinful. It was holy leisure. Imagine that for a second. Getting gently high while watching dancers swirl by torchlight, feeling warm and giddy, and being told by priests that this was, in fact, divine behavior. Kind of makes your cousin's barbecue seem a little dry, doesn't it? Wine glass wine, women, and wizards. Let's not forget the wine. While beer was the working man's go-to, wine was the nectar of the elite. And the pharaoh's vintners didn't mess around. Amphorae, those large clay wine jugs, have been found labeled with vintage dates, vineyard locations, and even flavor profiles. Some were laced with frankincense, myrrh, cinnamon bark, or, you guessed it again, narcotic herbs like mandrake and cannabis. Now, whether these additions were made for flavor or effect is up for debate. But the result? A whole room of high-ranking nobles listening to harpists, laughing over exaggerated stories of crocodile wrestling and sun god dreams, cheeks flushed from a sacred blend of spirits. Even Cleopatra reportedly had her own vineyard, and maybe even her own recipes, though her version of a girls' night probably involved a few more ASP-shaped goblets and scandalous togas. Performing Arts Festival of the Drunken One, when the gods got tipsy. Let me tell you a story that's equal parts wild and holy. Once upon a mythological time, the goddess Sekhmet, the lion-headed bringer of war and plague, was going on a bloody rampage. Ra, the sun god, feared she might destroy all humanity. So what did he do? He brewed 7,000 jars of beer. Yes, 7,000. Then, he dyed them red to look like blood and poured them across the fields. Sekhmet, fooled and thrilled, drank it all, passed out drunk, and woke up as Hathor, the goddess of love and joy. Thus began one of the most legendary festivals in ancient Egypt, the Festival of the Drunken One. Held annually, this event encouraged people to drink themselves into bliss in honor of Sekhmet's transformation. It was a moment of divine intoxication, where surrendering to joy was seen as a moral act. Attendees danced, sang, and drank until they collapsed in laughter under the stars. Try putting that on your event invite. Musical notes, music and hypnosis by harp. And what's a proper ancient Egyptian party without music? Harpists were the rock stars of the day, long-haired, elegant, and trained from childhood to soothe or stir the soul. Flute girls, tambourine players, and singers with honeyed voices accompanied them, creating a layered sound that pulsed through festival tents and palace courtyards. They didn't just play tunes. They created moods. Songs often included lyrics about love, death, and reincarnation. One surviving lyric reads, "Drink the wine and love the youth, for your bones will rest in the earth. But tonight, the harp is yours. Let the gods wait." Even now, those words ring with a kind of sleepy wisdom that makes you want to lie down on a pillow, listen to the night, and forget time. Eye magic at midnight. Love spells and sensual sorcery. Not all partying was about fun and food. Sometimes it was about control. The ancient Egyptians had entire rituals dedicated to what we might call manifestation today, especially around love. People would quietly slip out during parties, crush lotus petals into oil, mix them with honey and cinnamon, and whisper spells into the mixture. Let him dream only of me. Let his heart burn like cedar. Others might bury bits of a lover's hair beneath the garden floor where the couple danced, binding desire with intention. And yes, these spells were often performed while under the influence. Heightened emotions, altered consciousness, a sky full of stars, a feeling of invincibility. It was a prime moment to cast your wishes into the ether. Magical or not, the results. Let's just say Egyptian romance could burn brighter than a desert fire. Segment 5. The Lotus Lounge. Partying with the gods. The sun dipped low behind the sand-colored cliffs of Thebes, setting the Nile ablaze with golden ripples. On the rooftop of a limestone villa, the warm breeze carried the faint scent of blue lotus and sweet palm wine. Picture it, linen garments rustling softly, musicians plucking slow, hypnotic rhythms on their lyres, and delicate hands passing around shallow bowls filled with murky, fragrant infusions. This wasn't a palace. This wasn't a temple. This was your average elite gathering. Think of it like a house party thrown by the scribe class. They weren't nobles exactly, but they had enough money, ink-stained fingers, and connections to enjoy life at its most curious intersections. And here, among hieroglyph scrolls and gossip about temple politics, something otherworldly steeped quietly in every cup, the sacred blue lotus. Yes, in this chapter, we're not talking about incense smoke or divine rituals. We're talking about the true meaning of getting high like a god in ancient Egypt. Let's lounge in the lotus haze. Musical note: blue lotus. nature's euphoric secret musical note. The blue lotus, Nymphaea caerulea, was no ordinary flower. It bloomed dreamlike over the Nile waters, its petals glowing sky blue by day, folding gently at night. To the ancient Egyptians, it wasn't just a pretty aquatic plant. It was sacred, sensual, and, believe it or not, psychotropic. Imagine a botanical version of sipping spiked chamomile tea with a hint of euphoria. When soaked in wine, the flower's active compounds, likely including apomorphine and luciferine, produced mild psychoactive effects, calming sensations, mild hallucinations, and a floating, dreamlike awareness. Not LSD-level tripping. More like sipping herbal wine and finding yourself giggling over how shiny someone's gold necklace looks under moonlight. They didn't smoke it. They didn't grind it into powder. Egyptians would infuse blue lotus petals in warm wine or steep it into a mild tea. Think of it as their version of a mellow Friday night edible. The best part? You were technically communing with the gods while doing it. Blue lotus was associated with Ra, the sun god, and Nefertum, the god of perfume and healing. The flower symbolized rebirth because it opened with the sunrise. That alone made it a must-have at religious feasts and funerary rites. But that psychoactive edge gave it an extra kick during long temple vigils or afterlife prep. Skull dead drunk or divinely lit. Skull. Now, imagine you're a priest or priestess in a temple. You've been chanting in rhythmic tones for hours, swinging incense burners heavy with frankincense and myrrh. As the ritual heightens, you sip lotus-infused wine. Your body is relaxed, your spirit light. You begin to sway with the music. Your voice blends with others into a collective hum that seems to fill the hall with warmth. Are you drunk? Are you high? Or are you being touched by the divine? Ancient Egyptians didn't separate intoxication from spirituality like we often do today. Altered states weren't just accepted. They were encouraged in sacred contexts. By slipping into euphoria, you opened yourself to the gods' messages. You weren't impaired. You were closer to clarity. That's why depictions of banquets on tomb walls often show guests with blue lotus blossoms tucked behind their ears or held to their noses. These weren't just decorative. It was part of the experience. You were relaxing, honoring Hathor, the goddess of joy, love, and beauty, and you were simultaneously aligning yourself with the eternal cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. To be festive was to be spiritual. Musical notes banquets, brews, and bliss musical notes. A banquet in ancient Egypt wasn't just about roasted goose and honey cakes, though those were on the menu too. These events were soaked in symbolism. Guests were seated according to social hierarchy. Musicians played harp music that sounded like lullabies for the soul. Servants filled cups with lotus-infused wine, and everyone, from viziers to temple dancers, drifted gently into a haze of mild euphoria. Some tomb scenes show guests sniffing blue lotus blooms while a woman massages their shoulders. Others feature lines of dancers swaying in trance-like movements. There's a reason so many of these artworks include the lotus. It was the gentle guide into this intoxicating, meditative state. They weren't seeking escape. They were seeking harmony. And yes, the elite weren't the only ones. Even those with modest means had access to local festivals, where lotus brews, music, and dance blurred the line between religious ecstasy and recreational joy. Test tube modern science meets ancient ritual test tube. Fast forward a few thousand years, and blue lotus still fascinates scientists and herbal enthusiasts alike. While its effects are relatively mild compared to modern psychoactive substances, modern lab studies show it interacts with dopamine receptors, producing sedative and even euphoric responses. It's now legal in most places, sold as a herbal tea or essential oil. But unless you're steeping a lot of it, or combining it with alcohol, it's unlikely to produce the same effects the ancient Egyptians sought. Still, some adventurous travelers, curious historians, and ASMR seekers try sipping it as part of meditation, claiming it helps with lucid dreaming or deep relaxation. Not quite a magic carpet ride, but enough to let your mind drift on the waters of ancient memory. And honestly, isn't that what we all crave sometimes? A gentle unraveling, a calm surrender. Waxing crescent moon, the midnight meaning of the Lotus waxing crescent moon. The true beauty of the blue lotus wasn't in how high it could make you, but in how it offered a controlled, sacred space for surrender. Egyptians didn't fear these altered states. They embraced them, guiding them with ritual and rhythm, just like a lullaby in a temple's stone arms. So when someone tells you ancient people didn't understand biochemistry, remember this. They might not have had lab coats, but they sure knew how to brew a soul-soothing, God-whispering cup of wine. Now, close your eyes. Imagine the sound of lyres in the night, the scent of lotus floating through warm air, the flickering oil lamps casting gold on limestone. You're in the lounge of the gods. Segment 6. Honey, Fermentation, and the Real Ancient Buzz. The warm Egyptian sun once again climbed over the desert horizon, painting the sand with golden blush as if Ra himself was brushing the earth with fire. The air still hung heavy with the scent of lotus and warm stone, as priests in feathered headdresses greeted the rising day with reverence. But hidden beneath this dignified spirituality was another hum, one less ceremonial and more celebratory. Yes, dear listener, this segment is about how the Egyptians didn't just build pyramids and chant hymns to gods. They also loved to party, and they didn't hold back. We're talking about drunken festivals, honeymead intoxications, and even beer strong enough to knock a crocodile sideways. Now, imagine this. You're in the city of Dendera, not far from the Nile. The temple of Hathor, the goddess of love, music, and intoxication, looms over the plaza like a grandmother who throws the wildest parties. People are dressed in linen robes, hair oiled and perfumed. The drums begin, harps hum, flutes trill, and the festival of drunkenness begins. Yes, that was the real name. Let's talk about how the Egyptians got lit before that word even existed. The festival of drunkenness, not your average block party. Every year, the Egyptians held a boozy celebration in honor of a wild and dangerous myth. Legend has it that Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess of war and chaos, once went on a drunken killing spree to punish humanity. The gods, horrified, tricked her by pouring red beer across the land, making it look like blood. Sekhmet drank until she passed out, and was soothed back into being the peaceful Hathor. To commemorate this, people would gather in temples and homes, drink to oblivion, and literally pass out to honor the calming of the goddess. They believed that this ritual was necessary to prevent chaos and destruction for the coming year. Imagine your local New Year's Eve bash, except with gods watching, priests nodding in approval, and a divine excuse to black out. Women and men alike drank. Dancers spun through incense clouds. Priests read spells aloud to keep the vibes spiritual. But no one was pretending. This was a sacred, sanctioned hangover. Beer was their super juice. Forget modern craft brews with grapefruit undertones. The Egyptian version of beer, called Heket or Zythum, was a gritty, cloudy, unfiltered brew made by fermenting mashed bread loaves in water. It was thick, it was potent, and it was consumed constantly. Beer wasn't a luxury, it was a daily staple. Workers who built the pyramids paid in beer and bread. Children given beer, albeit less alcoholic, because it was cleaner than river water. Even the gods, sculpted on tomb walls, were shown accepting jugs of brew as offerings. And some evidence suggests the alcohol content of their beer could have reached modern levels, enough to get you comfortably buzzed during your average tomb painting shift. Archaeologists have even found ancient breweries. One site near Abydos, over 5,000 years old, had vats that could brew over 5,000 litres at once. That's not a hobby. That's a beer empire. Wine for the bougie set. While beer was for the common people, wine was the ancient Egyptian version of sipping Prosecco on a rooftop. It was more expensive, more rare, and often saved for the elite, nobles, priests, and pharaohs. White and red varieties existed, made from grapes or even pomegranates and dates. Wines were often infused with herbs, tree resins, and even sea salt. The point? Flavor, preservation, and maybe a little pharmacological zing. And wine had status. Tomb inscriptions bragged about vintage and vineyard like modern wine snobs brag about Napa versus Bordeaux. At banquets, servants poured it freely. Gold cups glittered. Drunken poets recited love songs. And the rich swayed beneath garlands, perhaps wondering if Osiris himself was watching from the afterlife, sipping along. Honey as a hallucinogenic highway. Honey, in most cultures, is a sweetener. But in Egypt it was everything. Food, medicine, offering, and possibly a high. See, in rare cases, bees gather nectar from toxic rhododendrons or oleander. The resulting mad honey can cause hallucinations and dizziness. We can't confirm ancient Egyptians intentionally sought this effect, but they were deeply knowledgeable about plants and their uses, both medicinal and mystical. Even Cleopatra used honey in her beauty routines. Honey was poured into offerings. Mixed with fermented dates, it could produce a syrupy, potentially psychedelic mead. And since they didn't filter their drinks or test their chemistry, occasional spiritual journeys may have happened by accident or on purpose. So next time you stir honey into tea, just know, somewhere an ancient Egyptian might have done the same, then floated off into a lotus-scented trance of their own design, when getting drunk was literally divine. Here's the most astonishing part. For Egyptians, getting drunk wasn't a vice. It was a virtue, when done ritually. To be drunk wasn't to be disgraceful. It was to be transformed, possessed by a deity, entertaining the gods. Temples held wine cellars. Priests managed alcohol rations. Gods like Hathor and Bes, the dwarf god of dance and fertility, were depicted holding jugs, flutes, and tambourines, egging people on. In modern terms, ancient Egypt gave you state-sponsored rave nights. The divine was in the dance, the drum, and the drink. As long as it was within sacred boundaries, you were encouraged to let go. Of course, not everyone did. Some tomb writings warn of the dangers of overindulgence. One scribe wrote that a drunkard stumbles and shames himself. But then again, that's been written on bathroom walls for centuries. Imagine it. Gently. Close your eyes now. Imagine yourself reclining in a shaded courtyard. The air is thick with myrrh and grilled fish. A harp plays in the distance. A friend pours golden beer from a clay pitcher into your cup. You raise it, laughing beneath your wreath of lotus blossoms. You drink, not to forget, but to remember what joy feels like, what being alive, truly alive, meant in a world ruled by both sun and shadow. Segment 7. Temples, gods, and trippy visions, the divine high. Picture this. The stone walls of a temple rising high above you, their surfaces painted with scenes of gods with falcon heads, serpent crowns, and lotus blossom halos. Incense coils twist through the air, thick and heady, swirling around torches that flicker with golden light. In the distance, a priest chants rhythmically in a dialect so old it vibrates more like sound than language. You're not in modern Cairo. You're deep inside an ancient Egyptian temple, perhaps in Abydos, or Karnak, or Dendera. And if you were a worshipper, priest, or initiate entering here thousands of years ago, you likely weren't walking in empty-handed. No, you'd have brought something sacred, something to open your mind, something potent. You might call it a divine offering, but it might also be a mild hallucinogen, because to the ancient Egyptians, getting high wasn't just recreation, it was revelation. Let's explore how the Egyptians may have gotten spiritually, mentally, and literally elevated inside their most sacred spaces. A divine prescription. The temples of Egypt weren't just places to worship gods, they were considered literal homes of the gods. Every statue of a deity in its inner sanctum was thought to be the god in physical form. And the rituals weren't symbolic. They were feeding, dressing, and waking the gods each day. To engage with a divine being on this level, worshippers believed they had to meet the gods halfway. That meant altering their consciousness. Think of it as tuning the divine radio frequency. You had to switch your mind to a different station. While there's no direct line in Egyptian texts that says, "Hey, we got high in temple rituals," we find clues. And like everything in Egypt, they're wrapped in mystery, metaphor, and magic. Blue lotus, the gateway flower. We've already met this alluring little plant earlier, but let's zoom in here because in temple rituals, the blue lotus took center stage. Depictions show priests and pharaohs sniffing or holding blue lotus blossoms during ceremonies. Sometimes they're even offering the flower to gods. The scent was believed to induce a euphoric or dreamy state. Mild, not overwhelming, but just enough to loosen the mind's grip on the world. Modern tests on blue lotus, Nymphea caerulea, have confirmed its calming effects. Some say it's like a cross between chamomile and wine. Just the kind of thing to gently open a spiritual door without knocking it off the hinges. Imagine the soft perfume of the flower rising with the temple incense, the chants growing in tempo, the firelight reflecting off gold. With your senses gently elevated, the boundary between human and divine may have seemed to fade away. It wasn't a party. It was communion. Myrrh and frankincense, scents that alter reality. When we think of incense, we often picture something pleasant, maybe nostalgic. But to ancient Egyptians, incense was a bridge between worlds. Frankincense and myrrh were two of the most prized imports from the mysterious land of Punt, possibly modern Somalia. These resins weren't just aromatic, they were psychoactive in subtle ways. Studies suggest that burning frankincense can affect brain chemistry, influencing mood and potentially even easing depression. Combine that with myrrh, which has sedative and dream-inducing qualities, and you've got a temple that smells not just divine, but feels divine. Worshippers may have spent hours inside these smoky sanctuaries, swaying to chants, eyes half closed, lulled into visions. Not wild hallucinations, mind you, but soft, flowing impressions of another realm. Did they see gods? Hear them speak? Maybe. DMT and the acacia tree. A hidden mystery? Here's where things get trippy. Literally. There's some compelling speculation, though not yet fully confirmed by science, that ancient Egyptians may have used the acacia tree, a plant known to contain DMT, one of the most powerful naturally occurring psychedelics in the world. Why acacia? Because it was sacred. It was associated with life, death, and rebirth. The god Osiris was said to have emerged from the acacia. The tree is everywhere in tomb art and funerary texts, and unlike other symbols, acacia had real chemical weight. Modern science tells us that the bark and leaves of certain acacia species contain DMT. On its own, the compound is inactive orally, but combined with other natural inhibitors, like some Egyptian herbs, it can induce intense visions. Now, before you imagine priests blasting off into hyperspace mid-ritual, it's likely this was a rare or elite practice, if it happened at all. But if they did manage to brew such a blend, what might they have seen? Did they believe they walked among the gods? Did the veil of the afterlife lift? And did they return with stories that became the myths we now call religion? The opening of the mouth ceremony. One of the most sacred temple rites was called the opening of the mouth, a ritual performed on statues and mummies to awaken them, allowing them to breathe, speak, and interact with the world. Imagine the intensity of this scene. The priest raises a special tool to the lips of a god statue. Incense thickens the air. Chants rise. The air buzzes. Some scholars suggest this ceremony wasn't just physical. It may have involved altered consciousness. For the priest, and possibly the participants, entering the right mental state was key. It wasn't just about ritual precision. It was about presence, being tuned in to a higher realm. Drugs or not, this rite was considered a moment of actual transformation. And if subtle psychoactives like blue lotus or incense were used, all the more powerful. Was it all just symbolism? Some argue that all of this was symbolic, that the gods were metaphors, that the incense was just for smell, that the blue lotus was only decoration. But symbolism in ancient Egypt wasn't separate from reality. It was reality. To the Egyptians, a symbol was the thing it represented. A statue of Horus was Horus. A flower that bloomed under the sun and floated on water was the soul's journey. So even if they didn't understand the chemistry behind a flower or a resin, they felt its power. They built sacred rituals around it, and they let it carry them closer to something divine. If you're still watching and picturing yourself in that torchlit temple, surrounded by lotus blossoms and clouds of incense, here's your moment. Backhand index pointing right, hit that like button if you think ancient rituals deserve more credit. Speech balloon comment below. Which ancient plant or ritual fascinates you the most? And don't go anywhere. We're about to head into one of the weirdest parts of the Egyptian high experience. Segment 8 is where things get spicy. Segment 8. The scented highs, perfumes, incense, and divine smokes. Itis, imagine this. You step into a grand temple in Thebes, around 1350 BCE. The air is heavy with aroma. Sweet, musky, smoky, intoxicating. The sun's rays pierce through high windows, catching curls of thick incense smoke swirling toward the vaulted ceiling like spirit tendrils. Priests in white linen chant methodically, their skin glistening with scented oils. It doesn't just smell spiritual, it feels otherworldly. This wasn't just about masking odor. This was a spiritual chemical bath. And you, unknowingly, are getting a contact high from the moment you walk in. Welcome to the sacred scentscape of ancient Egypt, where perfumes and incense weren't just for special occasions. They were the very breath of ritual, the highway of the divine, and yes, surprisingly potent. Now let's break down how the ancient Egyptians not only turned scent into an art form, but also, in some cases, used it as a euphoric gateway. Perfume as power. In Egypt, perfume was currency, status, and a means of divine connection. They didn't use it like we do today. Spray and forget. No, perfume in Egypt was worn like armor. It was spiritual protection, seduction strategy, and even political diplomacy in one tiny alabaster jar. Perfume wasn't just smelled. It was heated, poured, rubbed, and sometimes even shaped into cones that melted slowly on the head. These cones, made of fat and fragrant resins, would melt over hours during ceremonies or banquets, slowly bathing the wearer in sweet, musky oils. Imagine being at a dinner party, and instead of wearing cologne, your perfume melts down your face like candle wax in the most luxurious way. That's commitment to the vibe. Now, here's the kicker. Some of these perfume ingredients weren't just pleasing. They were psychoactive. Kiffy, the original spiritual high. One of the most famous incense blends in ancient Egypt was called kifi. This wasn't your run-of-the-mill temple incense. Kifi was made from a complex mixture: honey, wine, raisins, frankincense, myrrh, juniper, cinnamon, saffron, and sometimes, get this, blue lotus and other mood-altering ingredients. It was heated slowly, releasing a thick smoke that didn't just smell nice. It could calm nerves, lull you into a trance, and possibly even give you mild hallucinogenic effects when inhaled in large doses. The Greeks, when they later visited Egypt, were stunned by kifi's power. It was often burned at night to induce vivid dreams, and was even consumed in liquid form for its medicinal and potentially euphoric effects. Let that sink in. This was not just perfume. This was liquid poetry for your brain. Temple smoke and divine communication. Temples were basically giant scent machines. Frankincense and myrrh weren't just symbolic. They were functional. The ancient Egyptians believed the gods were drawn to pleasant smells. Incense was seen as a ladder between earth and the heavens. The more it smoked, the more direct your call to the divine. And here's something wild. Archaeological studies show that temples were built with intentional airflow systems. Vents and shafts were designed to move the incense smoke in specific directions, either toward the altars or along certain procession paths. These places weren't just filled with smoke. They were engineered for the experience. Can you imagine stepping into a temple and being wrapped in sacred vapor, your senses instantly numbed, your consciousness slowly shifting? Was it prayer? Was it spiritual manipulation? Or was it an ancient method of controlled group transcendence? The aromatic economy. Scent had economic weight, too. Frankincense and myrrh had to be imported from distant lands, modern-day Yemen, Somalia, and Ethiopia. These were literal gold-tier substances. Pharaohs sent caravans thousands of miles to secure them. In fact, Hatshepsut, one of Egypt's greatest pharaohs, famously organized a voyage to the mysterious land of Punt specifically to bring back incense trees. These weren't just fancy imports. They were life-or-death trade goods. Without incense, temples couldn't function, medicine lacked potency, and rituals felt empty. You weren't just buying perfume. You were buying cosmic access, perfume and the afterlife. And of course, scent followed Egyptians into death. Tombs were filled with oils and perfumes to help the deceased navigate the afterlife. Mummification itself was practically a perfume-making process. Bodies were soaked in natron, then infused with fragrant resins and oils to preserve them and probably mask the smell of decay. But those same resins, like pistacia, labdanum, and storax, had strong aromatic effects that lingered for millennia. When archaeologists opened Tutankhamun's tomb, the scent of ancient perfume was still faintly detectable after 3,000 years. Imagine that. Your cologne surviving the collapse of dynasties. Incense as medicine and magic. Ancient medical texts mention incense as a treatment for everything from anxiety to insomnia to evil spirits. Want to ease childbirth? Burn juniper. Feeling depressed? Heat blue lotus and myrrh. Want to ward off a curse? There's a smoke for that. Some incenses doubled as offerings and as potions. Burned one way, they calmed the gods. Brewed another way, they calmed your nerves. The boundary between medicine and mysticism was, well, smoke-thin. Modern parallels. Today, we light scented candles and call it self-care. But to ancient Egyptians, it was soul care. Burning incense wasn't ambience. It was a form of direct spiritual communication, emotional regulation, and in some cases, light chemical escapism. Ever walked into a candle shop and instantly felt floaty, nostalgic, a little dissociated? That's just a fraction of what the Egyptians were engineering in their temples. Now imagine that multiplied tenfold, infused with sacred geometry, divine chants, and psychoactive oils. That's what we call vibes eternal. Before we move on, what's the strangest scent memory you have? Something that took you straight back to childhood, or maybe gave you a weird high just from nostalgia? Let me know in the comments. I read all of them, and if you're still awake, or still fascinated, hit that like button so the algorithm knows you're vibing with these ancient truths. Ready to drift into the next segment. Segment 9. Hallucinating with the Gods, Ritual Trances and Temple Highs. Imagine it's the middle of a moonlit night in ancient Thebes. The Nile murmurs softly in the distance. A temple stands glowing with torchlight, its massive columns casting shadows that dance like spirits. Inside, a woman sways slowly to the beat of a deep drum. She's not alone. A circle of priests, priestesses, musicians, and initiates hum low, rhythmic tones. The air is thick with incense so potent, it's not just smoky, it's intoxicating. And the woman, she's about to meet a god face to face. Or at least, that's what she believes. Welcome to the mysterious world of ancient Egyptian ritual trances, where spiritual ecstasy and drug-induced visions blurred into one surreal experience. This wasn't just faith. It was a full-on psychedelic communion with divinity. High priest. More like high priestess. While the modern stereotype paints Egyptian priests as serious men muttering chants in dusty tombs, many of the most powerful spiritual figures were women. Priestesses, especially those serving the goddess Hathor or the lioness-headed Sekhmet, were central to these otherworldly rituals. These women weren't just keeping sacred fires burning, they were channeling divine energy, sometimes using music, sometimes using movement, and often using very potent plant-based substances. Why? Because the gods didn't speak through PowerPoint. They came in colors, shapes, visions, sounds, and a dizzying rush of sensation. And in ancient Egypt, you didn't just worship a god. You became their vessel. The sacred buzz. Music, movement, and mushrooms? Let's talk about how the Egyptians engineered their divine contact highs. First, music. Temples echoed with rhythmic drums, the sistrum, a metal rattle, and chanting. These weren't just for ceremony. Repetitive, rhythmic sounds can push the brain into trance-like states. Think of it like ancient EDM, but instead of a DJ booth, you had a sacred shrine, and instead of glow sticks, frankincense. Second, dance. Swaying, spinning, and stamping were all part of the ritual. Much like the whirling dervishes in Sufi Islam or the trance dances of the Sand People in Africa, Egyptian movement was designed to disconnect the body from the conscious mind. The goal: reach the point where you stop thinking and start receiving. But most fascinatingly, there's strong evidence that natural hallucinogens were used. While not every ritual involved them, some ceremonies, especially those invoking visions or oracles, likely included psychoactive plants. Ancient texts mention sacred blue lotus, known to produce calming and euphoric effects. There are also suggestions of mandrake, henbane, or opium, all of which were known in the region. Some were burned as incense, others were brewed into tea or wine, and some were eaten in full doses by high-ranking ritual participants. The house of life and the lab of the gods. Temples weren't just places of worship. They were also pharmacies, labs, and schools. Inside every major temple was a per-ankh, or house of life. Here, priests and priestesses compiled spells, practiced medicine, and brewed elixirs. These houses were hubs of both spiritual and scientific exploration. Herbs and minerals were carefully categorized. Potions were crafted with astonishing precision. Need a potion for a stomachache? They had that. Want to repel evil spirits? Got you covered. Need to enter a trance to speak with Horus? Here's a custom blend of blue lotus, myrrh, and a dash of whatever was behind that secret curtain. Some recipes were so secret they were written in magical language, encrypted in metaphor and symbol, only to be unlocked by the initiated. These weren't amateurs, they were spiritual chemists, channeling the divine, when trance becomes oracle. Some rituals weren't just about experiencing the divine, they were about interpreting messages from the gods. In elite temples, special initiates would enter trance states during sacred festivals. During these moments, they were considered oracles, mouthpieces of deities. In these states, they would offer prophecies, guidance, or warnings to pharaohs, generals, and nobles. And while the message might come from the gods, the method was very earthly. A careful combo of fasting, incense, dance, ritual chants, and yes, perhaps a few drops of temple-approved psychoactives. From modern comparisons, we might liken this to the Oracle of Delphi in Greece, whose cave emitted hallucinogenic gases. Egypt's rituals were similarly theatrical, atmospheric, and psychoactive. But while Greece had the Pythia alone, Egypt had full ritual ensembles, high priests conducting ceremonies, musicians keeping rhythm, and priestesses channeling divine speech in poetic, sometimes cryptic verse. The god within, why it mattered. So why did the Egyptians go to such lengths to induce divine trances? It wasn't just for show. To Egyptians, accessing altered states of consciousness wasn't woo-woo. It was sacred work. It allowed humans to merge with the gods, glimpse the afterlife, and return with knowledge or healing. It was proof that we weren't separate from the divine, but reflections of it. Unlike modern religions that often separate the spiritual from the sensual, the Egyptians embraced the full spectrum of human experience as divine pathways. Emotion, music, sex, food, scent, and yes, even altered consciousness. They didn't just talk about gods. They felt them. They became them. Could you handle it? Imagine, for a moment, stepping into one of these ancient temple rites. The heat of fire on your cheeks. The perfume of burning myrrh in your lungs. A drumbeat echoing in your bones. A sip of a golden wine laced with blue lotus. You're swaying in time with dozens of others. And then, your body vanishes. Light, music, scent, memory, all blend into a swirl. You see Anubis rising from smoke. You feel Isis' hand on your chest. You hear a voice say, "You are the gate, and I am the path." Whether you'd believe it or not, the feeling would be real. The Egyptians weren't chasing highs for fun. They were building sacred bridges between the earthly and the divine. Segment 10. What they smoked, sniffed, and sipped. The psychedelic toolkit of the Nile. Now that we've swirled through temples and tombs, gods and grave goods, it's time to get a little more grounded, or perhaps less so. Because in this final chapter of our hypnotic descent into ancient Egypt's chemical wonderland, we'll examine what might be the real star of the show, the mind-altering substances themselves. What exactly did ancient Egyptians use to get high, slip into trance states, or experience what they called divine communion? Let's take a dreamy stroll down the Nile's botanical lineup of highs, each more fascinating, and sometimes frightening, than the last. Blue lotus, the flower of forgetting. Let's begin with the sacred superstar of Egypt's herbal high scene, the blue lotus, also known as Nymphaea caerulea. It's everywhere in Egyptian art, offered to gods, tucked into the hands of mummies, and twirled in the fingers of partygoers in wall paintings. But this wasn't just for decoration. Blue lotus contained a porphine, a psychoactive compound with mild sedative and euphoric effects. Imagine reclining on a papyrus mat by the Nile, cup of wine in one hand, blue lotus petals steeping in it like sleepy herbs in a dreamy tea. You sip, and the edges of the world blur just a little. A warm calm drapes over you like linen in the sun. Some scholars believe that Blue Lotus made people feel not drunk, but dreamily detached, half here, half in some other world. Maybe that's why it was so often linked with resurrection, rebirth, and sex, all things that lift you out of ordinary reality. The lotus wasn't smoked. It was typically infused, either into wine or made into a tea. And yes, it was probably mild by today's standards, but in a world without screens or streetlights, a mild high could go a long way. Mandrake and henbane, the dark twins. Now let's descend into the more mysterious side of ancient pharmacology. Enter mandrake and henbane, two potent plants with deep magical reputations. Mandrake, Mandragora officinarum, was feared and revered across ancient cultures. Egyptians called it the apple of love. But this apple bites back. It contains tropane alkaloids, which in large doses cause hallucinations, dizziness, and even delirium. The plant itself looks like it's hiding a secret. Its roots often split like little limbs, like a miniature person trapped underground. Pulling it out was said to be so dangerous it could kill you, unless you used a dog. In ancient Egypt, mandrake was likely used by priests and healers, but very carefully. A little might calm you or lift your mood. A lot could make you forget your name. Henbane was similar, a spiky, yellow-flowered plant that ancient Egyptian magicians may have used in rituals. Inhaled as smoke or brewed into a potion, it caused strong hallucinations and a dreamlike confusion. Used alone, these could be dangerous, but used with skill, perhaps in secret priestly ceremonies, they could bring visions, madness, or insight, depending on the dose and the gods. Myrrh and frankincense. High Church. We often think of frankincense and myrrh as incense for religious ceremonies, and they were, but they weren't just about smell. Modern researchers have discovered that frankincense smoke contains psychoactive compounds like insensilyl acetate, which can relieve depression and induce calm, almost meditative states. It's not LSD, but it is mood-altering, like a scent that shifts your whole mind. Imagine walking into a temple filled with thick, curling smoke. The scent is sweet, resinous, ancient. Your heartbeat slows. Your breath deepens. You are not quite yourself anymore. You are somewhere in between. Myrrh had similar effects, soothing, calming, and deeply associated with funerary rituals. The embalming process wasn't just preservation. It was a scented journey toward transcendence. Myrrh helped that journey happen in spirit as well as smell. Cannabis. The forgotten herb? Did ancient Egyptians use cannabis? The evidence is hazy. Some scholars believe hemp was used for ropes and possibly medicine. Ancient texts reference treatments for glaucoma and inflammation that match the effects of cannabis. Some mummies have even tested positive for cannabis residue, though this is still debated. If they did use it, it probably wasn't for parties. More likely it was used by healers, perhaps burned during ritual or administered as an oil. But one thing is certain, the Egyptians knew their plants. Whether cannabis was part of their high life or not, their botanical expertise was centuries ahead of its time. Opium. The god sleep. Now for the strongest contender in the Egyptian psychoactive arsenal. Opium. Derived from the poppy, opium was known across the ancient world as the plant of joy. It dulled pain, brought sleep, and, at higher doses, created powerful, dreamlike euphoria. We know the Egyptians had access to opium by at least the New Kingdom. It was likely imported from the Near East and used both medically and spiritually. In temple rites, a priest might offer opium-laced wine to initiate a trance. In the tomb, it might be used to ease the pain of the dying, or to simulate the great sleep of eternity. Opium was dangerous, yes. But in small amounts, it was sacred. A plant that bridged the worlds, not unlike the blue lotus. Alcohol, the great equalizer. And of course, we can't forget alcohol, the daily drink of farmers and pharaohs alike. Egyptians brewed thick, hearty beer from emmer wheat and dates. It was both food and fun. But in the temples, it became transformation. Priests drank to enter altered states. Festival-goers drank to see Hathor, the goddess of love and chaos. There was even a myth where beer was used to calm a murderous goddess by tricking her into thinking it was blood. Drunk, she became joyful. It was a story of rage turned to peace, and maybe a lesson in the power of surrender. Conclusion: ancient highs and modern wonder. And so we arrive, gently swaying, at the end of our journey through Egypt's psychoactive past. From dreamy lotus to dangerous mandrake, from incense smoke visions to opium dreams, the Egyptians had a deeper relationship with altered states than we often imagine. These weren't just party tricks or painkillers, they were spiritual bridges, sacred keys, tools to dissolve the self and touch the divine. Maybe that's the greatest takeaway of all. The ancient world wasn't just obsessed with death, it was enchanted with otherness, with all the ways we can step outside of ourselves, through gods, plants, and ritual, and return changed. So next time you light a candle or sip something warm, imagine a world where scent, silence, and sleep could lift you into the presence of eternity. And maybe that world still exists. If this strange and dreamy ride through ancient highs sparked your curiosity, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more hypnotic journeys into the past. Comment below with the weirdest ancient drug you learned about, or where in the world you're watching from. Until next time, may your dreams be lotus sweet and pyramid steady. Crescent Moon.